I've made a mistake that's going to cost me everything. I'm writing this now because if someone finds it, they might understand what happened here. Or maybe it's just so I don't go completely insane before the end comes for me. My name is Nathan Wyatt, and if you're reading this, I'm probably already dead. Or worse. It started when I moved into that cabin in the woods. A cliche, I know, but the price was right, and I needed a place far from the city. Too many memories lingered in the streets, too many ghosts of my past whispering in every bar and alley. So I sold everything, packed my meager belongings, and drove upstate to a cabin deep in the heart of the hollow forest. The locals warned me. They didn't do it outright, of course. That would have been too convenient, wouldn't it? No, their warnings were subtle sideways glances when I mentioned where I was headed, a few muttered words I could barely make out. The most direct came from an old woman working the register at a gas station. She had a face that looked carved out of tree bark, and her hands trembled as she handed back my change. The hollow doesn't like outsiders, she said, barely loud enough for me to hear. Her eyes were milky, but her voice carried weight, like she was speaking from somewhere deeper than herself. I laughed her off, told her I'd keep my wits about me. She didn't laugh back. Instead, she shook her head slowly and said something I couldn't quite make out. I didn't ask her to repeat it. Part of me didn't want to know. The first few days in the cabin were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking, clearing away cobwebs, and patching up the roof where the shingles had started to rot. The cabin was older than I'd expected when I first saw the listing, but it had charm. It felt secluded, private, like the world couldn't reach me there. That's what I wanted most, to be unreachable. The woods surrounding the cabin were dense, darker than they had any right to be even during the day. The trees grew close together, their branches tangled like fingers clasped in prayer. When the wind blew, they whispered. I told myself it was just the sound of leaves rustling. It didn't sound like leaves, though. It sounded like voices. The humming started on the third night. It was faint at first, barely louder than the crackling of the fire. I was sitting in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey, when I heard it. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe the wind moving through the trees in some strange way. But when I stepped outside, the air was still. No wind, no sound, but the usual chirping of insects. The humming followed me back inside. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, a low, droning sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I thought it might have been the pipes in the cabin old plumbing. Maybe, but when I checked, everything was silent. The humming wasn't in the cabin. It was in me. It kept me awake that night, a constant presence just below the surface of my thoughts. I must have drifted off at some point, though, because I woke up in a sweat, my ears ringing. The dream I'd had was vivid, too vivid to dismiss. I was standing in the woods, surrounded by trees that stretched higher than I could see, their branches twisting and curling like the arms of some enormous creature. In the distance, something moved. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel its presence. It was massive, hulking, and wrong. Its silhouette was all angles and spikes like a skeleton made of knives. It was watching me. I could feel its gaze burning into my skin, though it had no eyes that I could see. I told myself it was just a dream, a trick of my subconscious brought on by stress and whiskey. But when I stepped outside the next morning, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The ground around the cabin was covered in footprints, not human, not animal. They were large, impossibly large, with claw marks so deep they gouged into the earth. I spent the next few days trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. I threw myself into work, chopping wood, fixing the creaky floorboards, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked out into the woods, I thought I saw movement shadows shifting between the trees, shapes that didn't belong. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I didn't believe it. Then I found the cellar. The door was hidden beneath a rug in the living room, its edges so warped and rotted that it was a wonder I hadn't fallen through. I didn't notice it at first. I'd moved the rug to sweep, and there it was, a wooden hatch with a rusted iron handle. It was locked, of course, but that didn't stop me. I found a crowbar in the shed out back and pried the thing open. The wood splintered easily, almost too easily, as if it had been waiting for someone to break it. The air that rose up from the cellar was foul, thick and damp, and reeking of something I couldn't identify. It wasn't just the smell, though. It was the weight of it, the way it pressed down on me like the air itself was alive. I should have closed the hatch right then and there, but I didn't. Instead, I grabbed a flashlight and climbed down the creaking wooden stairs. The cellar was small, no more than 10 feet across, its walls lined with dirt and stone. The floor was covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the earth. They were jagged, chaotic, like they'd been scratched into the ground by something with claws instead of hands. Bones littered the floor, not just animal bones, but human ones. I recognized the shape of a skull, its jaw shattered and its sockets empty. The air was heavy with the stench of decay. In the center of the cellar was a pit. It was deep, too deep. When I shined my flashlight into it, the beam didn't reach the bottom. The edges of the pit were lined with more symbols, etched so deeply into the stone that they seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. As I stared into the pit, I felt something staring back. It wasn't a feeling I could explain, but it was real. Something was down there, something massive and alive. I slammed the hatch shut and locked it, but the damage was done. That night, the humming grew louder, almost deafening. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was inside me, crawling through my veins like poison. When I closed my eyes, I saw the pit, the endless black void, and the thing that moved within it. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in the way I understood life. It was ancient, primal, and hungry. The dreams got worse after that. Every night, I woke up screaming, my throat raw and my body drenched in sweat. The thing from the pit was in every dream, its shape shifting and writhing, its eyes, or what passed for eyes, burning into me. It spoke, though not with words. Its voice was a low, guttural sound that resonated in my bones, a sound that carried with it a single, undeniable message: "You are mine." I tried to leave. I packed my things, threw them in the back of my truck, and drove as fast as I could. But no matter how far I drove, I always ended up back at the cabin. The road twisted back on itself, the trees closing in until I had no choice but to turn around. The forest wouldn't let me go. The creature came for me on the 7th night. It was just after midnight when I heard its heavy footsteps outside the cabin, the sound of something massive moving through the trees. The ground trembled with every step, the walls of the cabin creaking as if they were about to collapse. I grabbed the shotgun I'd found in the shed and aimed it at the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the barrel steady. The door didn't open. Instead, the creature came through the walls, its massive, twisted form melting through the wood like it wasn't even there. Its body was a nightmare of flesh and bone, its limbs too long, its face, or what passed for a face, a mass of shifting, writhing shadows. Eyes stared out from every part of its body, glowing with a sickly yellow light. They weren't human eyes. They weren't even animal. They were empty, hollow, like looking into the eyes of death itself. The shotgun did nothing. The creature didn't even flinch as I fired round after round into it. It didn't bleed. It didn't make a sound. It just kept coming, its limbs stretching toward me like they were made of liquid. When it touched me, I felt something cold and sharp, like needles piercing every inch of my skin. I don't remember much after that. I woke up in the cellar, lying on the floor next to the pit. My body was broken, my arms and legs twisted at impossible angles. But I was alive. The creature was gone, but I could still feel it. It was inside me now, crawling through my veins, whispering in my mind. I don't know how long I've been down here. Days, maybe weeks. The whispers never stop. They tell me things I don't want to know. They tell me about the people who came before me, the ones who lived in this cabin and disappeared without a trace. They tell me about the pit, about what lies beneath it. The pit isn't just a hole in the ground. It's a doorway, a gateway to something older than the earth itself. Something that's been waiting for centuries, feeding on those foolish enough to wander into its domain. The creature isn't just its guardian, it's part of it, an extension of its will. I can feel it growing inside me, consuming me from the inside out. My skin is starting to split, black tendrils writhing beneath the surface. I can hear the voices of the others now, the ones who came before me. They're screaming, trapped in the same endless torment that awaits me. If you found this, burn it. Burn the cabin. Burn the forest. Burn everything. Don't let it spread. The creature doesn't just take you, it becomes you. The hollow doesn't forgive, and it doesn't let go.